Okay.
We're live. Okay.
All right. So we're just getting an audio issue worked out with Sean, but we're going to get started. So first off, welcome back. Does anyone have any thoughts, questions that they'd like to share about last week?
I had a question. How is this going to be analyzed? I had the assumption back from my college days when I was doing some work like this that this would be transcribed and the language would be analyzed, but I don't know if that's actually going to happen. What's the plan with this language?
Well, that's an interesting question. Alice, I don't know. You have any thoughts on that?
I guess my thought was to do several of these groups. This is the second, and then look at what happens from each of them. Each of them would be hosted by a different person. The first one was a psychologist, who's Matt. We have a couple of other people in the works. If any of you are interested in putting together a group where you're talking about an issue, my hope would be, my book is entitled Catalysis, as opposed to analysis. Analysis tends to be, this happens because of that. When I think of catalysis, I think of moving forward, like Matt's second question. Imagine something new. What could we do with this process if we all came together and stopped fighting with each other and started thinking about some new creative synthesis? And so I guess I'm hoping that we would go there today, and after doing several other projects, look at a process, look at what can come of it and make it better, make it different, just move forward. I'm trying to imagine ways to get unstuck.
I see.
I don't know. So you have an anthropology background.
I do.
Do you have any thoughts on that? Did you?
I mean, all I could do is add my own experience, which was we did a pilot study for the CDC, and it was all, we interviewed people, and then we did other activities too, like card sorting, and it was all about like capturing the language they were using. So I suppose that's sort of a different trajectory. I mean, I don't even know if that's what you would want to apply here, but I mean, maybe it would be an interesting.
That would be very interesting.
I never assumed this was a research. I mean, I have a PhD in social sciences, and there's no, I just thought you're trying to get some just general ideas, more sort of an inductive kind of process, as opposed to, because to me, it's not set up that way, but.
Well, and I think it's very much about different perspectives, and I guess that's a good lead into our first question. So one thing that came up several times in last week's discussion was in-person verification of facts, which particularly Elka and Dan were talking about. And when you compare the situation today to the trusted newsman era, today there exists a temptation to ask somebody with firsthand experience to provide you with the details of what happened. But just as a particular camera angle can fail to provide the full context of what it's shooting, a firsthand account can be similarly limited to one person's perspective of an event. So part of the problem may be that while we have developed internal alarms and defense when dealing with bias in traditional media, we assume that our primary sources are giving us accurate information when they may not be. So the question is, do you agree or disagree with this? Are there examples that come to mind? And in addition to the aforementioned problem, we may not even be consciously aware of how much information we're getting through viral distribution. Facebook in particular is designed in such a way that it fosters these giant games of telephone where nobody is really sure of the source of a caption, image, or news story. So what do you think about this? Can you think of any examples where you have experienced distortionary effects of social media? So I want to look at this as a question of perspective. I think in response to what you're asking, it's not a research project per se, but I think we are trying to arrive at some sort of a conclusion. And I think that where we were led last week is in the direction of there is something going on with this sharing of perspectives that did not exist before and somehow is not perhaps as constructive as maybe one would assume that it would be, if indeed that is part of the problem. So that's what I want to dive into today. If anyone has any responses to that. Anyone want to go first? Okay.
Up to me. I'm sorry for this this snafu here, and I really don't know what happened. I didn't change any of the settings from last week, and last week was fine. I've tried everything here, so I'm going to try and stick with the group. It's kind of strange not having heard all of your comments earlier, so I apologize again if I hit on thoughts that everybody already spoke about, because I can't hear anything you guys are saying. So I guess Adrian is going to try and prompt me with the questions whenever it's my turn. I'll try and respond as best I can. I won't be able to hear your feedback though, which kind of defeats the purpose as well. As far as last week goes, I really enjoyed last week's discussion with all of you. It was great meeting you all. I enjoyed the learning more, the diverse views that everybody had and the backgrounds that we all came from, and it really added to my interest in the topics. And I was hoping that we could do the same thing today, along with following along with the first round and second round questions that Matt provided. That's it for as far as last week goes. I don't know if you want anything else from me, but we'll just continue on with, I guess, the first round, I guess, Matt. Sorry.
So it's all right. We're talking about perspectives, and I'm going to text this to him in just a moment. Jay, why don't you go ahead with what you were going to say, and I'll catch Sean up.
Okay, I'm not sure you're going to like my response because I have a whole different take on this. And I think part of the problem is the erosion of trust that's been somewhat manipulated in terms of the traditional, what I would call professional news services. And personally, I have more trust in professional journalistic sources with fact checking and with media bias measurement, all of which is easily accessible, than I do with what I would call anecdotal evidence, which is what you're talking about, that's rife in social media. So I don't use social media as a news source, ever. And I think part of the problem is that the traditional sources, you know, AP, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, all of whom have their biases, but still have journalistic standards of triangulating stories, of fact checking, of retractions when they're wrong. And that's what I use as my basic source. I don't use anecdotal evidence. I don't use anecdotal data that is somebody's experience. That experience may be totally valid. I'm not saying, but it is, as you said, from a particular perspective. And sometimes people have agendas, and that could, in fact, line up with what I read in the other sources, which is great. But I would never totally rely on anecdotal sources. That's me.
All right. Does anybody else want to go?
Yeah, I have some words I can say on primary sources. I would say there's an overall, like everybody agrees that once the internet came out, we could all communicate with each other a lot quicker, right? That's like a fair statement. We can all, you know, we have access to each other via all these, the tubes of the webs, you know, the series of tubes. So what we gained was a line of communication to each other that was not interrupted by the commercial process, that did not need to be supported by ad revenue, right? Like we're all paying our electric bills and we all bought our phones and skip the ads if we wanted to, because, you know, we can, we try, right? Nobody likes to be advertised to. We all hate the commercials, you know. And I would say that, and I think that this is like a recognized fact, like the minorities are the message is fuller, right? Like the language that we're getting now with like the addition of the internet, I would say it's fuller. You're getting a second opinion, and it's a totally like from another planet second opinion. They're, you know, these news sources on the internet, they don't know each other. They don't pay the same taxes. They don't play the same game. They're not like business competitors with each other. They don't, you know, have like joint retirement saving. I mean, everything that like is not reported, but is fact about the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and, you know, the news we're getting within the status quo, so to speak, right? Like they're not advertising the, I don't know, what they don't want us to know. They're not telling us what they don't want us to know. Let's put it that way. But then, I mean, I think there became a point where the trusted newsman just isn't trusted anymore. And in fact, it's like I look at the trusted newsman and go, what's his bias today that he's not reporting on? You know, like,
Right.
What am I not hearing? I mean, obviously, I know what happened. How is this person reporting on it? You know, I'm not watching the news to become informed anymore. You know, I'm like watching the news to analyze their analysis. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, as opposed to Jay, I get, oh God, I hate to say this, but it's true. I get all my news off of social media. And, I would say I find out about events that happened, like real things that happened. I find out about, I don't know, like Seattle City Council made a decision, or, like things that really happened. I don't, I guess, question of like, what is the truth and how do we arrive at the truth? And I don't really think that the talking heads on TV are going to give me the truth. I don't. I think that they're, by default, is going to be something they're not saying. And I will look for what they're not saying via social media. I hope that makes sense. I don't know. That's my response.
Yeah. So I think it's a multi-layered issue. And I think that it's not sort of a thing where you can say that the mainstream media doesn't work, so that's why we're relying on this, and this will work, or this doesn't work, and so we have to rely on the mainstream media. I think that what we're talking about here is a compounded problem where people's trust in the media may have eroded at a time when we're developing these alternatives. And so as a result of that, we turn to this alternative that nobody planned, nobody really understands. It's just this organic thing that appears as a result of this interconnection of nodes, a series of tubes, as you say. But this organic construction of nodes that was essentially designed for the purpose of enabling the government's information infrastructure to survive a nuclear war. So it's meant to be decentralized in this incredibly complex web. But I think that what we want to talk about is what are the consequences of turning away from traditions, whether or not those traditions work, and progressing towards something that maybe we just don't understand. I'm going to let Sean go next before he loses track of the conversation too much. So all right.
Okay, I'll jump in. I'm trying to follow Adrian's cues here, and I'm getting bits and pieces of the discussion, so I'm trying to keep up with it. As far as using social media for my news source, I don't use social media that much. I'm primarily a Facebook user. I've been using Facebook for over 10 years, and I started out just using it as a way to stay in touch with family and friends and coworkers, and that was what it was meant to be, and that's what I enjoyed. It was just a tool to stay in touch with people that over time you tend to space out and lose touch with. But over the last couple of years, I can say that, with the last administration that was in, and the political rhetoric really ramped up over the last 4 years, and I ended up getting dragged into it, unfortunately. And I don't use it as a source for my news. However, I do find that there are times when articles are posted on there that I wasn't aware of, and I look at the source. I do pay attention to it, if I think it's a credible source. And I will read it if it's something that will provide me with information I'm interested in finding out about. But that's not where I go to find out or learn about an issue. But if it's there and posted in front of me and I say, oh, wow, that's something that I wasn't aware of, let me check it out, and it looks like it's coming from a credible source, I will delve into it a little bit if I have the time. A lot of times I'm just scrolling by, looking at things, something that catches my eye that might be of interest, and something that, you know, whether it be sports, it could be any topic really, it doesn't have to be political. But over the last couple of years, I would say I ended up getting into more and more discussions on the political rhetoric that was out there, just trying to dispel some of the disinformation or misinformation that I thought was being, you know, promulgated by others out there. When I had facts that I could use to refute or rebut, then I would try and present them as best I could, just to kind of, you know, try to balance out the misinformation. And that's the way I tried to use it. And now that the election is over and we're out of that, I'm trying to back off or backpedal out of the political comments and commentary, and just trying to limit my use of Facebook to what I originally planned it to use it for, as a social tool more than anything else. So let's see, one of the questions was, how do you determine if the source is credible? These are just sources that I'm familiar with over the years. If I see something like, I've been reading Newsweek from the early 70s. And so I find that to be a credible source, reliable source, different articles there from different authors that have come from. And so I see an article from Newsweek, for instance, I consider that to be credible, and I'll take a look at it. And of course, yeah, you know, I find myself vetting the source, but sometimes you end up going a little bit further, not just vetting the source, but vetting the story, where you look at and read the story and then you say, that doesn't add up. The story here doesn't add up, you know? And so that's when you say there's something wrong here, something doesn't fit, it doesn't sound right to me, it doesn't make sense. That's when you start looking for answers to those questions in the back of your mind. And that's the way I handle, you know, trying to weigh out what's credible and what isn't. That's it for me. Thanks.
All right.
I can.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Adrian, as well. Alice, you want to jump in?
Sure. As opposed to the good old days when accurate information was presented by or you assumed that, you know, Walter Cronkite was giving you accurate information. Over time, I've come to conclude that information that I'm getting from TV, from newspapers, from social media is not going, or it'll be partially accurate, and it will be spun based on the person or the source. In fact, someone sent this to me, someone who's in the audience. It's a media bias chart with names of news organizations and where they stand on the most extreme liberal, most extreme conservative perspective. And that's true with my friends. I know the person and I know the article and I know what they're trying to communicate, so I can read the headline and then decide if I want to read the article. Otherwise, I sort of get the idea very quickly. That said, I, as a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst for too many decades, I think of human facts as facts that are just as credible and just as primary sources as what happened out there is how I interpreted what happened out there. And so I think I tend to have a lot of friends across the political spectrum. I pride myself on having Facebook friends that go from extreme right to extreme left. And I learn a lot from listening to them. In fact, yesterday, in anticipation of this, I found myself watching Fox's tribute to Rush Limbaugh. I learned a lot just by how they saw him, how they presented him. It was eye-opening. So anyway, that's.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, so I think where we are is that we have a couple of,
I think Danny wanted to speak. He had.
oh
his hand
yeah,
up.
Dan, go for it.
While it's a new term, social media, I think that whole concept's been around for a very long time. Once the movable type started coming into play with the original printing presses, governments wanted to clamp down on those things really fast. There's one guy, former New Yorker, passed away, I guess, in the late 30s, early 40s, who happened to be a news guy, but we all know him because he coined a phrase called supernatural. He would spend his times over at the library on 42nd Street collecting little news articles from news organizations from around the world saying New York Times reports frogs coming, falling out of the sky, or fish falling out of the sky, or mermaids found wherever. These were all from credible news sources. The man's name was Charles Fort. He was he created a magazine called Fortean News. If you look at his little biography, I mean, the book is not that big. It's a pretty short book on his history. While he was a newsman in Brooklyn, give you a time frame, back in Brooklyn, because there was a Brooklyn newspaper he worked for. He decided to go. He was sent out to do to check out on this music event that was going on. He was the only person who decided to go out of like all the other newspapers. And all the newspapers reported, yes, it was a very fine event and so many people were there and this person did this. None of those news people were there. They didn't report on like the 5 people who got shot. This was like around 1905 at a music event in Brooklyn. And none of the reporters were there. None of the papers picked up, but it was that single one guy, Charles Fort. You fast forward, how the medium wants to portray an individual. Some of the older people or people who were around at the time could say, like, when Kennedy was first put on TV versus Nixon, you have the Kennedy-Nixon debates going on. Everybody who heard it on the radio said Nixon had won it, and everybody who saw it on TV said Kennedy won it. Which was right. I wasn't around at that time, but I've heard it growing up. Fast forward a few years later, we have this thing called 60 Minutes. The first real infotainment thing came out. What were they selling? They weren't telling you the news. They were selling you the entertainment as news. Now we have like all these channels like true crime stories and murder mysteries. Are they telling us the news, or they're showing the story? So trusting facts firsthand. I believe Ronald Reagan said it best: trust but verify. I'll see whatever, I've had to collect information from people I did it for like 20 years, collecting information firsthand from people, and I trust them, but I verified everybody. And I suggest everybody do the same for me, because I'm not the arbiter of truth. I'm just the arbiter of my perspective. That's all I can give. I wish So when it comes to Facebook, yeah, I'll see stories that'll pop up and it'll pique my interest one way or the other. And sometimes I've had to ask friends of mine who were either in law enforcement, in medicine, in politics. Is this true? What is happening here? Can you explain this court decision to me? Or, hey, did this arrest actually happen that way? And I was like, or what's supposed to happen? So I would ask people in that field specifically. I've actually had friends who did that, did similar for me. They would ask me what was going on, what was supposed to happen, and what actually versus what actually did happen. So I keep away from Facebook. Unfortunately, tied to right now, but I'm not on Twitter. I'm not on Gab or any of those other ones. When I go to YouTube and I watch certain people, I know that they are giving a specific perspective, but the people I look at, they all cite their sources. They'll say, this is where we got our source from. This magazine, that magazine, this reporter wrote this on this date. And a lot of times now people are trying to take things off the internet, which doesn't work. But yeah. So for me, everything came down to trust but verify for everybody, including news organizations. I guess that's about it.
Okay.
Can we respond to each other?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Because there was a lot of interesting things and I'm trying to assimilate it. Look, I think we have to put to bed that there are by every source has a bias. Every source has a bias. And I agree with Elke that the information we get now on social media, et cetera, is fuller, but there's also a huge amount of noise. And my problem is trying to figure out what do I pay attention to and what is noise, which is another aspect of, I listen to NPR. Okay. They don't get advertising, but you could say, well, they have foundations supporting them, et cetera. So, and on the other end of the spectrum, again, a particular constituency or whatever, somebody representing them, they have an agenda. I may actually even agree with their agenda, but I need to understand they have an agenda. And to Alice's point, I don't think it's about media bias like that chart said. The one site that I go to has both dimensions, has a media bias, meaning, okay, the New York Times tends to have a liberal slant. The Wall Street Journal tends to have a more conservative slant. I get that. Then there's a whole other aspect, which is, what are their standards? What proportion, when you do fact checking, how do they measure up, et cetera? That's a whole other dimension that one also has to look at. And so I think in many ways, Danny's right, but he's sort of kicking the can down the road, because then you can ask, okay, well, where do you verify your sources? And Elke's solution may work better for Seattle City Hall, where you have you have by nature a multitude of perspectives, even in your own experience, because you live there. But what happens with national news and international news? And that's actually where it kind of gets a little dangerous in my view, because suddenly you can get an email or you can talk to somebody thousands of miles away, but who are you talking to and where is their stake? So I think it's a real Gordian knot, and maybe I'm naive or old-fashioned or something, where I ultimately go back to a version of what Danny's saying: what can be verified, who's doing the verification, what standards are being used. And I do think, actually, and I could be naive here as well, that I do think that more and more constituencies are in fact being paid attention to, even by the mainstream media. I do think there's access now that there hasn't been before. There's no perfect solution, but I think that with sort of checks and balances, professional standards, fact checking and verification, I still tend to trust the what we could, for lack of a better term, called traditional media, then social media, when I have to pick one or the other. We'd have to make a choice. But I do get more color and more fuller, to use Elke's term, picture often by supplementing it with individual experiences.
I'm curious, for Elke, seeing that you did your sociologist, right?
I work in legal administration, but I do have I have
Yeah.
a Bachelor of Arts in anthropology.
Okay, I'm kind of curious. From your perspective, I understand that the person observing the group actually affects the group to a certain extent by being,
Yeah.
even by their, So do you see that also as being a problem with the news organizations in general, not in specifics?
Yeah. God, I totally had, let me just try to gather my thoughts here. So, we have this crux of the trusted newsman and the social media. Oh, I know what I wanted to bring up. We wanted to talk about examples and talk about Bernie, but Danny, I'm sorry. What was could you repeat your question?
Does the observer affect what is actually happening? So as like through anthropology, if an anthropologist is actively watching a group or an observer is watching a group,
Yeah.
does it alter the behavior and then the reporting of it for like scholastically or?
Yeah, I mean, so there's one joke that I know about anthropologists, and the joke is that no one wants an anthropologist in their living room, right? Anthropology, the big problem with anthropology is that they're always studying down the socioeconomic chain, and they are, traditionally, if they're going out into the field, literally the jungle, they're bringing aspirin, they're bringing first aid, they're bringing like technology, they're bringing rewards for the time that they want, so, and that is hella problematic. So yeah, the observer most certainly affects the behavior of the folks, right? And the science of anthropology, they would try to remove that bias. So like they're looking at like, okay, I know that my presence is affecting things, but I'm just gonna try to measure the really basic stuff, like who's making the food, try to like look at the things that like aren't being affected, right? And then they measure that, and they measure like kinship structures and things that are not going to change based on the observable, whatever. And then they base their science on that, right? Like, what can we learn about this society based on how much their babies weighed, what kind of calories they were taking in, like family structure and how many people are paying attention to the kids, like that kind of like factual information. So yes, to answer your question, in anthropology, absolutely, the observer affects, and we see that today, and now we have all of these observers observing online, and now everything's all upside down because everyone's being observed, including the talking heads. What are you going to do? It's all, we're evolving, we're making something new. The things that we don't like are being deconstructed, and such is life.
I got one follow-up question. Do you know anything about Sapir-Whorf?
Sapir-Whorf?
How
Yeah,
language
he was,
controls how people view things?
language in society. He's a big linguistic anthropologist.
Yeah, because with at the present time, it's been happening. Well, I guess over the last decade, more and more with the inclusion of being PC or PC culture or altering definitions of words and terms, trying to alter society. I didn't know if that was something that could also be seen through the eyes of anthropology. So,
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds, yeah, for sure. If I may, we were talking, or one of the things that was on the question was like wanting to bring up, Danny and I were requested to bring up actual events, right? And so, when I think about social media and stuff, I go right the Democratic National Party's selection in 2016. Dun, dun, dun. Bernie Sanders versus Hillary Clinton. Man, oh man, did I learn different things depending on the source for that issue. The one that comes to mind is Debbie Wasserman Schultz, like deliberately not allowing Bernie Sanders access to the email rolls. And that didn't come up in the national news source. I found that out because Bernie Sanders' page was like, hey. And now, I mean, we all know that actually happened. Debbie Wasserman Schultz stepped down because, you know, like that was fact, you know, and that fact was not revealed by the Democratic National Party, you know. But then on the flip side, now we, you know, then of course, because of all of the Bernie Sanders support, then we get blamed for, now we have Donald Trump. Thanks a lot, Bernie Sanders supporters. Now we have Donald Trump because you undermined Hillary, blah, blah, blah. And does that haunt me? At the same time, what do you want me to do? Like, I died when Bernie Sanders was up against Hillary. It was awful for me. I don't know. And I guess that would be partly related to my primary source issue because I lived in Burlington, Vermont when I was in my early 20s. I had an experience where I'm like in college and my friends are, you know, I'm meeting my friends, whatever. It became clear to me that everyone in town like really loved their mayor. And this was so weird to me. I was like, what do you mean you love your mayor? Like politicians are jerks, right? Like we hate politicians. And like, no, you don't even know, man. Bernie Sanders. I mean, so that was like my introduction to Bernie Sanders. Like and then all of a sudden he runs for president and I just died. I'm like, oh my fucking God, there's a good person and he's running for president. Like, wow. So I felt like this primary source where I'm like shouting from the rooftops, like Bernie Sanders is amazing. You guys don't even know, you know, and it doesn't matter. And wow, what a different place this would be if Bernie Sanders had actually made the way. But as far as examples of social media influencing my thoughts and opinions, that was a huge one for me. Debbie Wasserman Schultz and the email scandals of the DNC and how she wasn't being fair and they were supporting Hillary and suppressing Bernie, and that was a fact.
you want me to give one example, Matt? Or-
Sure, you can go for it. Yeah.
All right. Not too long ago, well, before, you know, before all this lockdown and stuff happened, around 2010, I worked as a sewer guy for about a year. And most people, you know, even plumbers look down on sewer guys. But the one thing that they didn't pay attention to was what we actually did. Now, yeah, we go in, we fix clogs and drains, and things like that. Yeah. We also work in confined spaces with infectious diseases and things that go boom every day. Now you're like, okay, so what? sewers are not generally clean places. And no, I didn't ever found an alligator. No alligators were found at that time. What I did was every hospital, school, and laboratory actually has specialized sinks, specialized tanks, specialized pipes that handle infectious diseases and certain things. Everything from liquefying animals to dropping down whatever. And before they go into the public sewer system. They all do. Every hospital who says, we don't do animal research, they do animal research. Yes. With the amount of infectious disease wards I used to walk into, and I walked into one, and I'm not going to say their name, walked into one room where everybody in that room had more degrees. There was more degrees in that room than any thermometer that you've ever seen. Because everybody was MD, PhD, ADHD, name it, they had it. They had a backed up sink. Woohoo! They send in me. All right, big whoop. Okay. Can't figure out where the pipes are. We finally had to go in, and I found this office, who's been in operation for over 20 years, had a 10-foot of glass pipe impacted with tens of thousands of infected needles. Now, nobody in their right mind would throw down a needle, especially with high levels of education like that. Yeah. We did find it. We did correct it. They were like, with all that being said, okay, what does this have to do with the price of tea in China or the lockdown today? Getting suited up for biohazard labs was a day-to-day process, which I had to do. That's besides putting on rubber gloves, that's putting on the full bunny suit, full face respirator, up and including to a reverse respirator, which actually pumps air into the suit and pushes everything out. I did not go into that lab. I refused to go into that lab. That was the only lab I refused to go into because that gets scary. In that year time period of me walking into infectious disease wards or morgues or wherever, one lab actually had N1H1, avian bird flu, bloodborne diseases and things like that. How many times do you think I actually saw a medical professional wearing a mask? If the number was 0, you would be correct. They were never worried. Because if it ever got to that point, other problems would have occurred. I walked into one place where they had nuclear waste because of the machines that they had. You go for radiation therapy or whatever. They have the waste around. That was the only time I ever seen a department head actually worried. And I was like, I told him, I says, I'm not worried what's in the room. He says, why aren't you worried? I said, there's only one thing that worries me in this room, and it's in that sewer. And they're like, what's in the sewer? I says, I don't know. He says, I understand everybody here is scared about this room. I said, but there's 1,000 people who literally passed this room. Nobody's came down with radiation poisoning in the last 6 months. I'm walking in the room with the most intelligent person in the hospital with the best equipment. He says, I'm not worried. I'm worried about you guys tossing stuff down the sink that you're not telling anybody about. And that happens way more times than most people think. It's a lot more.
Whenabouts was this?
Huh?
Whenabouts was this?
About 2010, 2011. That was right after Mr. Obama taking office and me losing my job. So, so when I look around and I'm like, people are worried about masks. Okay, so you go to the CDC. What did the CDC say about masks? Masks don't work. Not the ones that they're telling you about. The ones I wore worked. Full face respirator. I would actually have to shave everything. It's a perfect seal around the entire face. The mask that most people have, the reason is eyes, nose, mouth, ears. Oh no, nothing can get through my mouth. eyes, ears. People not wearing gloves, you would have to wear the full suit for it to actually work. You know, there's actual real procedures to handle stuff like that, and how we had to get suited up. How do we have to take off the suit? The whole thing.
Danny, can I ask one clarification?
Sure.
Because this is on media and stuff. You're talking about protection, right?
Yep, PPEs.
You're not talking about shedding.
No.
The difference. Okay.
Oh,
my
yeah.
understanding is we wear masks to protect other people because we may be shedding, we may be asymptomatic and stuff like that. So it's less about, I don't wear a mask to protect me. I wear a mask to cut down on my shedding if in fact I'm carrying the virus. That's my understanding.
If you go to the YouTube page for the CDC back in February of last year, there's a fine doctor from the CDC who comes out and says, masks don't work. This is how you put on your paper mask. She literally comes out. It's a 3-minute video put out by the CDC.
But Danny, so this is a great case study of how you figure out information. So there's this one YouTube video that was done at the very beginning when almost nobody knew what the hell was going on. And there's probably hundreds of YouTube videos on CDC or Fauci, whatever, coming saying, yes, wear your mask, because they may not be perfect, but then people aren't necessarily wearing them properly. So wear them properly. So do I, in listening to you, who has experience in this, to Elke's point of primary sources, you know, do I think about that 3-minute YouTube video in February, and it was on the CDC, so you know, theoretically it's legitimate. And how do I weigh that against other, you know, as we accumulate knowledge about what's going on? Probably, if you go to the CDC, there's probably either other guidelines or YouTubes that are telling you wear a mask, double wear a mask. This is how you wear a mask. You know, make sure your nose is covered, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my problem. I think it's a great case study. That's my problem. Do I listen to Danny and that one YouTube, or do I try to get a broader scope and try to understand this in the whole context? With all the respect that you have more experience in this than I do. So I'm much more inexperienced than you, but from a consumer point of view, even a news consumer, you know, how do I do this? How do I deal with that?
Okay, there's 2 things. One, the first thing, like I said earlier, I'm not the arbiter of truth. Go out if you can, talk to people who actually run these labs, or how their labs are set up. What I found.
Typically, we don't have access to that, realistically, right? We don't have access.
Actually, no. I actually still have friends who run around in that field. Not in sewers, but actually MD, PhDs. And hey, guys, what's going on? I mean, yeah, it takes a little work on everybody's part. So you have to do your own homework. And that's a really fun thing. But the other thing is, you had pointed out, Jay, that us being the consumers of this medium, it's coming more and more across that we're not the consumers. We're the actual items being sold by Google and Facebook and Twitter. We're the intermediary. They're prepping us to be sold, our information and our buying habits to be sold to other companies. So we're no longer the consumer. We're the product being sold.
I totally agree with you, but that's a whole other issue, I think, in terms of what is all this social media about? Yes, I think that's a great observation, that we're, you know, even to Elke's point, that we're even in social media, you know, we are commodities. And so how does that affect the coverage? How does that affect what we see or don't see? It's a good question.
Yeah. I still, one of the fun jobs I had to do when I was working at that sewer company was, well, I had 2 main jobs besides going into the sewers. Was one, I had to fill out the MSDS books, the Material Safety Data Sheet books. If you really want to creep yourself out, go online, type in MSDS. Every single item that's made in the world actually has a sheet, and sit there and read them. You will have a different perspective on the world, on what's being done.
All right.
And the other item that I had to do was before going into these places, you have to check the air quality.
Yeah.
We check the air quality for mainly three things: high, low level explosive fumes, too much oxygen, and there's this thing called hydrogen disulfide, which actually turns off your nervous system. The running gag was, if you saw me, run, follow. That was the running. I've only had to run in that 1 year period 3 times. that was a scary thing.
All right. So I want to summarize a little bit here. I think we have a few. I think we're touching on a few different issues here. There's an access issue. There is a perspective issue. I think there is a quantity issue. If there is an oversaturation of the mediums that we are using to access information, then it can become perhaps harder, not easier, to figure out what's going on. So, to your point, I think, yeah, so we can trust but verify, but then the process of verification is when you have so many different people telling you so many different things, it's almost an issue of where do you even start if you want to try and verify. So I think we have perspectives that can be distorted when you are looking at when you're looking at a primary source, say a video of, something. Let's say you had made a video. Let's say you had made a video of what was going on in the hospitals as an expose. I think let's just take that for an example as a hypothetical. I think there are a few issues you could run into. One is that you may capture one part of the picture and miss something else. I'm just speaking hypothetically. And people automatically take what you're showing them at face value, and they react emotionally and say, this is horrible, and they bring out the torches. And there could be another side to it. And then on the other hand, you have the opposite issue, which is if you are doing this expose, right? And if you were, who was that guy? Upton Sinclair, right? If you were Upton Sinclair in a century ago, and you did an expose, everybody paid attention because it was a big deal. But if you're Danny with a video camera filming something and putting it on YouTube, you could end up with the opposite problem to the overreaction, which is an underreaction, because you are one of a million people disseminating information at the same time. And there's too much of it. And nobody, and people may react and then forget about it 5 minutes later. So what we're trying to get at is what has changed, and not only what are the problems that we're dealing with today, but or not only what has changed, not only what has changed about the way we get information today that may make it more difficult, but also whether indeed we are in a worse situation than we used to be. Because I also started this with a premise that we are in a crisis right now because of a lack of fact checking. And if indeed we have transformed into a society where we have this immense access to information, is that responsible for the increased divisions in our society? So it's those three issues that I want to get at. Is there a problem being caused by having too narrow a perspective when you look at a primary source? Is there a problem of oversaturation? And how has this altered our society, and is this indeed the cause of our divisions? And is it worse than it was, or are we just exposing problems that always existed, and that's why we're in this state of division? So, Dan, yeah.
I think there's one other factor. Is why are we seeing this information? Is it for some sort of motive profit for the news organization? I think we've all heard the statement, if it bleeds, it leads. That's how you get more viewers. Well, why do they need more viewers? So they can sell more soap, on their commercials, or, whatever things that they're selling us. What don't you want on there? Well, what's the stations or the overarching companies, philosophy, or what they're trying to sell, and because of that, we may not see certain stories. We may not hear certain things. Fortunately, I look at overseas news organizations for news here in the United States. EU News, BBC, Skynet, Sky News, Australia. They talk about United States a lot. I mean, they really do. And I'm like, and they put it in perspective as to how what's happening here affects them. Which is kind of, astonishing that, my small town politics here in my section of New York City affects somebody in New Zealand. Which is kind of a little shocking to me, so there's a bigger, there's a quiet why, not to how or to what ends. We know the ends. It's to make the station more money. If they could get their exclusive, if they could get the best shot, or they could get the most viewers, they do it so they could get the best ratings to get the most money out of advertisers. That's one of the things I've been worried about, when it comes to all news.
Alice?
I think in a very general way, it's drive, fantasy, desire, defense that makes us motivated to hear things in our own way. And that goes for companies too. You know, Facebook is, who was it that said corporations are people too? Everybody jumped on him. But it's true, you know, in the sense that they want what they want. And they want to present something so that they can get what they want. So they can get you to see, what they want you to see. That's true for individuals. And it's true for, you know, on a larger scale as well. And I think that has much to do with the Democratic Republican divide is, you know, people arguing from their own vantage point, their own histories, their own desires, and they then take it and make it into a statistic. And then they argue the statistic, and you hear both, and it's very hard. Yeah, I often feel like I'm arguing apples and oranges, or abstract and concrete, like the mask thing. You know, for some people, it's just, it's what you do. It's what we do to protect each other. I feel more comfortable in a store with everybody wearing masks. You know, New York, we almost died as a city back in the spring. Yeah, I'll wear a mask, you know, even if I'm on the street by myself. Other people will say, no, I don't need to do that. Let me use my judgment. You know, I don't need to wear it if I'm vaccinated or walking down the street. And but they'll take a statistic, or they'll take an example like yours, a primary source, and argue from there. See, he says it's not necessary. What we do with that, I don't know, but I think we need to argue, or we need to actually use personal data as part of the data. That's yeah.
Jay?
It might be the sociologist in me, but I think not that technology is a huge thing here, and I get that, but I think that's the wrong emphasis. I think it's much deeper than that in terms of what do you trust? The individual versus the collective. To Alice's example, I would tell that person, okay, you don't want to wear a mask. You think it's okay to go get drunk and be out on the road? And they'd say, oh, probably would say, no, that's very dangerous. Well, duh, you know, but it's a shift in thinking about understanding that your behavior has consequences for other people. I think it's that, but I also think it's trust. I don't think technology is gonna solve trust. And I don't know the answer, but it's, you know, it's clear that most of us, including me, use sources to have our views affirmed rather than informed. And I'm probably as guilty as anybody else. And how do you walk that back? I don't think technology is the answer. It might be leadership. It might be a community org model where people start rebuilding trust. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I don't think technology is going to solve it.
I agree. It's the genie out of the bottle. We're never going to get that, put that genie back in. To go with Jay, I've heard the retort about you know, driving drunk and on the street, you know, driving drunk, you know, affecting other people. There was opposite version to that. The opposing version was, well, whatever happened to my body, my right. Why are you telling me what to do with my body? And you can't control me. It's just the opposing view that I've heard in the past.
Jay, can I ask you, what do you think? I know this is a big question, but maybe you have a simple answer to it. What do you think has changed? Do you think that technology has created a problem Or do you think that technology has exposed a problem that always existed, or is it something else entirely?
So you're asking me because I'm the oldest guy here. I get it. In terms of what has changed, I don't think it's a simple answer. I do think at the end of the day, technology is a tool, and we need to look at it as a tool. And obviously, it's a tool that's totally a factor of how it's used. Have certain, and by the way, I think it's been a lot of positive stuff, right? You know, to Elka's point, it's made the distribution of knowledge that much more democratic, and we at least get to hear or see things that we may not when it's not. But I think if I had to, I think Black Lives Matter is a great example. I think for a lot of white people like myself, a year and a half ago, if you would have talked about white privilege, we could have not understood what you were talking about. But I think through Black Lives Matter, a lot of people have been informed and sensitized, and a lot of light bulbs have gone on in my head and a lot of other Caucasian heads that say, oh man, yes, there is such a thing as white privilege. And I don't think that would have happened without, and by the way, for me personally, I probably understood that better from watching NPR and MSNBC and Joy Reid and other people talk about their experiences, to Elke's point of primary resources, but essentially also ultimately getting a lot of those voices in that environment much more than in social media, for me personally. You know, and seeing a pattern in terms of what was going on in Minneapolis and in Atlanta and whatever, and in Toronto. So I'm not sure. I think ultimately, I think technology is a tool, and it depends how it's used. And I do think that a lot of stuff that we're experiencing today has always been there and has been either brought to the fore or manipulated or exacerbated. So all those things are going on, I think. I'm not sure I've answered your question, certainly not in a simple way, but I'm not sure if I've answered it at all.
Well, you also mentioned community engagement, and I don't know how I don't even know where I'm going with this, but you mentioned community engagement, and I wonder if maybe we just need to maybe we just need to interact more in these small communities. On the other hand, if you reduce the size of the network to make it to prevent this oversaturation of people's intake of information.
Well, Matt, I don't think it's either or. And I think there's a famous saying, all politics is local. And I think this is maybe another face of that the change needs to happen at the local level. And we can still use Zoom, for example. Yeah, you could have town meeting, whatever, even after COVID. But I now use Zoom for a lot of my local stuff, and it's very accessible, and people exchange kind of like we're doing, but even at the local level. So it may sound a bit over facile, but I do think that at some point, this may be as much a ground up kind of solution that we need. And it will take a lot of resources and a lot of leadership and a lot of goodwill. But if I had to put my money on something, and I think, by the way, a great template might be what happened in Georgia with the grassroots organizing to get people to vote, to get people registered. So maybe there are grassroots efforts to get people in a smart way to interact and to rebuild trust. and to figure out how can we find out, how can we learn in a way that ultimately contributes to the common good.
Else?
I had a thought, you asked specifically about social media. And my first thought was also that it's kind of hopeless. It is what it is. We can't take it back, but it's fostering splitting and needing to think differently about how we communicate and such. But then I had this fantasy of if I were able to reprogram Facebook right now, here's what I would do. I think it leans left because of the emojis, because it's emotional, which the left is always accused of being emotional. Today I'm doing a happy dance. Tomorrow I'm crying. Next day I'm going to a birthday party. What if we had emojis that were more structured? Like this thing. Elkin and Jay are on the hyper partisan liberal. Danny is the skews conservative or something like that. I don't know. And so you argued from there. If Dan and Jay were going to do a discussion about masks, you're coming from your background, your history, your experience, and you're coming from yours. And you can talk from there. If we don't do that, it becomes, you jerk, you didn't, you don't see it my way, and I'm gonna cancel you. If you come in, and the other thing is it's ownership. In couples therapy, it's important to use I statements. I feel like this because of where I'm coming from, rather than you do this wrong. On social media, we keep doing that. You do this wrong. You're stupid. You're uneducated. You're a white racist. You're a sheeple. You're whatever you are, and that stops discussion dead. But if we say, yeah, I'm a hardcore liberal, and then talk to me, it might help with some kind of empathy, a space for discussion that doesn't exist.
Elka, did you raise your hand before?
I did. Yeah. I have some things to say. I have written down in front of me, is a narrow perspective misinformative, right? And that was like from what you were saying earlier. I kind of think, what do I think? I don't think that there's going to be there's no like one answer. We're in the midst of a big Gordian knot, and it's gonna take time for it to unravel. I think for a long time the minority perspective was ignored, and now the minority perspective is, you cannot ignore it because it's all over social media. And that's uncomfortable when, everybody gets defensive when the opposing view makes themselves known, right? One of the things I learned in school, that was one of those golden nuggets you get when your professor has a conversation with you and you're not really going by the syllabus, so to speak, but this is like your experience, right? I had a professor tell me that, people tend to overemphasize what is known, and the outlier information is very informative. She said, you think that you need a big, huge, large pool of people to study from in order to make a statement, in order to understand fact, right? You need it demonstrated by a super large class. But in actuality, you can look at 10 people and the trend is probably going to show itself within 10 people, right? We don't like it. It goes against our very DNA to acknowledge the outside view, and that's like evolution. That's survival. When you have something that works, we go with it. But we do need to evolve, and those outside perspectives will save us at times. And I don't know that anything is really, in my mind, there's not a cure-all. There's just like it's a process we're going through, and we all just do our best. And, I think that social media, I wouldn't want it to go anywhere. I think we have this big giant country and all this space in between us. And, if we're going to get along, we literally just need to be rubbing elbows more often. That's it.
Yeah.
Well, so there's I guess there are a few ways we can go with this, and I'll be brief, and then we can get back to whoever wants to go next.
Some interesting things on chat, by the way.
Yes, there are people talking on chat. If you want to look at the chat, you can.
What's the chat?
I'm not actually sure how to open it. It's just, there's a button at the bottom that says chat. If you want to respond to the chat, feel free. You don't have to. It strikes me there are a few different ways that we could go with this as far as solutions go. And I say this tongue in cheek in that I'm not actually proposing solutions. But because there are some who would say, well, we have to get rid of social media, and that's the problem. And we just need to isolate into smaller groups and stop taking in so much information. Then you could also be Elon Musk and say, well, the problem is we're only going halfway in our embrace of using technology to unify us, and that's the problem. Elon Musk didn't actually say this, but I mention him because then the solution, if you go that way, would be, well, we all need chips in our heads so that we don't just see, so that we're not just being exposed to the same information, but we actually think the same way. And so I guess I guess the question is, if we're not going to embrace any kind of an extreme solution, because I don't think we are heading in the direction of taking some extreme action to rectify this problem. I don't think that's gonna happen. Well, we might be heading in the direction of getting chips in our brains, but who knows? But what can we do in some constructive way? Dan, if you want to.
Yeah, I think Alice actually hit on a great point. Taking personal ownership in things. I've had discussions with friends over the years, and this was mainly during Mr. Obama's administration. And a lot of people would turn around and say, well, that's your president. That's not my president. No, he's our president. I may or may not like what they did. Yeah, I may or may not like my congresswoman. I may or may not like my mayor or governor, but they're not somebody else's problem. We are there. They are mine. This isn't you. They're by separating people out by ethnicity, economics, job, location. It's just more and more divisive. Look, this leads to something that Elke has said. I actually did something. I did one of my bucket list things was I want to go to every state in the union in the lower 48 and have barbecue. So far, I've hit 14 states out of the 50. Why? Because I just want to see what's over there. I don't know who those people are. Find somebody who I never met. So one of the things I did was 2 years ago, I flew out to Salt Lake City, wanted to hang out in Nevada for a little bit, and I took the train by myself from middle of Nevada all the way back to New York City, which is about 3 days and 17 hours with a 6-hour layover in Chicago. Why? Because I wanted to see somebody. I wanted to see different people. Why do they eat what they do? Why do they think what they do? And wow, I actually got to see a lot of people. Some people I agree with, some people I didn't. But I also saw one thing: we're all together, and it was kind of interesting thing. One great. I'll wrap up real quick. One great experience was I was up in Vermont, up in Waitsfield, and there's this barbecue spot there, and I was like, what do Vermonters know about Tex-Mex? They don't know nothing. It was one of the best dinners I've had in a long time. It was awesome, and everything was locally sourced, which it was an incredible thing. So just going out and meeting new and different people, over a meal was an awesome thing to try to bring me a better understanding between me and somebody else.
Jay?
Ownership. I have absolutely no doubt that somebody who believes the election was stolen and Donald Trump is really the president has total ownership of that view. I don't see that as a solution. And Danny, to me, the fact that you have made this trip, have made this effort, already tells me something about how you want to open yourself up, how you want to be in that situation. But I think most of us, by a huge amount, are not in that place. And to me, it's like, how do you get a level of goodwill, trust, desire to communicate, respect of the other? We're so far away from that, including me.
Oh, I understand.
That's to me that to me is the challenge.
Oh yeah, I totally understand. I totally understand where you're coming from. The one really interesting thing that came across to me, and this my little journey so far, was I've been in arguments with hardcore conservatives, and they knew that I opposed their points on whatever it was we were talking about. They shut other people up for me and allowed me to say my question or confront them on their facts. They shut other people up. On the opposite end, when I had similar conversations with people on the left, they would literally, I actually had literally somebody put their hands over their ears going, la, 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 I can't hear you. I can't hear you. I'm like, this was an adult. This was a full grown, I was like, wow, this is, I'm sorry.
Would you, from your experience, are you saying that left-leaning people are much more closed to hearing other opinions than right-leaning people based on that experience? Would you make that general?
Well, that was just one of several unfortunate encounters. Friends of mine who I had friends of over 40 years, they've just cut themselves out of my life altogether, even just because of this last election. And these are men that I've known since junior high school. And I was like, wow, this is really sad. I mean,
I'm still trying to understand your conclusion and what it's based on. That's all.
yeah, I'm allowed to
I'll just try.
disagree.
Sorry, I don't mean to.
Yeah.
I don't want to get
I'll-
too into psychological differences between left and right, because
No, that's not my point. My point is really the one overriding issue is how do you know what you know? Okay. I have an experience or several experiences with, and I have with people who are very, very radical, who will not hear the other view. I probably have similar, but let's just say I've had Danny's experience of being, having people stand up for me on the right. Do I generalize from that experience that liberal, left-wing people are much more closed than right-wing people? That's really, I think, the issue.
I would like to
Okay.
respond to that. I think that there is we can assume from a conservative standpoint that just going by logical, like left and right sort of overview things, right? So conservatives are guilty of being kind of cruel, maybe, and like liberals are guilty of being like stupid, right? So a conservative, Danny, your conservative friends who allowed space for you to say your question, right? To me, that is a conservative acting defensively, and overemphasizing their willingness to hear the story, right? In a moment where it's under pressure and there's an argument going on and you have conservatives, their defensiveness is going to be, I'll hear you. I'll hear you out. I am not a cruel person. I'm going to hear you out. And then I'm not going to take any of that information into account and blah, 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 right? And then on the other side, what I'm trying to point out is that somebody's going, la, 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 and somebody else saying, please, tell me your point of view. Those are still sort of the same, they're flip sides of the same coin, right? So then the liberals, we err on the side of being like, what is it, like illogical and, like believing in a fairy tale, right? Like, oh, that's like the common criticism of a liberal, right? Is like, yeah, good luck, la la land, like you're living in a fantasy, right? And so when a liberal hears your argument and goes, I can't, like they're I don't know. I just see those things as like the same type of knee-jerk reaction to accepting or not accepting new information.
I understand where you're coming from.
We gotta go down this road. We got 17 minutes left. Go for it.
Just to go with that, you may be very, very correct. It's just the next step over would have been, and unfortunately, or fortunately in some cases, was I actually could disagree with the conservative, and we can go out and yell at each other, call each other, oh, you're an idiot, or you're being inflexible. And they're like, we're still having dinner tonight, right? Yeah, okay.
The plan.
Yeah, we're still gonna have dinner tonight, right, guys? Okay, great. Yeah. You're an idiot. Okay, great. You're stupid. And then unfortunately, on the other hand, and this goes to the guys that who cut me out of their lives, they would be up to and willing to get me fired from my job, cast me out into the street, homeless. They were really that vehement in their
I just
position.
want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying that split happened on political lines too?
Yes, that was scary. And these are people I've known. Like I said,
Those people tend to be the liberals, and the conservatives are the guys you could disagree with and go to dinner. I'm just trying to understand.
Yes. I mean, and it was so bizarre to me. It was a very bizarre experience. I mean, it just didn't happen at one time. This happened over the course of the last what, 12 years? And I was like, wow. It was mind-boggling to me. It was almost, it left me befuddled. And I'm not the only individual I've seen that happen to. I know other people. I actually was talking with a friend of mine about this about 3 weeks ago, because he's in a similar situation where people he's known for years have done the same thing to them. And he actually went out, helped them, for free legally in the courts, to help them, resolve issues. And just because he may have a political stance they disagree with, they were out for blood for him just because they disagree with them. And you don't see that on the same on the conservative side. Just to go with one more thing, Elke, I usually make a very distinct point between somebody being left and being liberal. I remember liberals when I was growing up, they didn't believe in segregation. They believe in freedom of speech. They allow freedom of expression. They talk more about unity. We have to help each other out. There was more of a community standard, and now it seemed like a shift, and it shifted hard from my small view. I could be totally wrong, and go for it. I'll shut up.
I would say, the liberal, just something that I would want to share as my, bleeding liberal part. Maybe I have been guilty of going, like I can't. And I would say it comes from a place where a liberal is like, they're advocating for the lowest of us in the socioeconomic status, right? Like a liberal is a person who's like, but the poor, but the poor. And so I don't know, it's like adherence to that line, I think, that makes a liberal start getting shrill and blocking out all the other information, because they're like, undeniably the poor need help, and that's the bottom line, and nothing you say can dissuade me from that. I think that just, I don't know, it's just like the feelings that are coming up when I am, or the roots of the feelings or my convictions are coming from the fact that I'm like, the homeless on the sidewalk, okay? Are you walking past them every day? Because I am, and it sucks, and that's when I get really loud and like shrill.
Alice, did you want to go next?
As you're talking, I'm reminded of the Rush Limbaugh tribute that I saw last night. And the line that stood out to me was somebody, whether it was him or somebody else, said that a whole lot of people voted for Trump and wanted Trump in office, and the liberals don't understand us and they don't want to try. And that spoke to me, because I hear that, it was right. Oh, you're a Trump supporter. You must be one of those racist, no white supremacists, selfish, whatever. Go away. You're bad is the message. And I feel like I want to hear these people. And when I do get to engage with them, I learn so much about how they see the world. But it's hard work. And social media is just so easy to say delete, delete, delete.
Jay?
Yeah, that's how I like. That's an advantage to, I advocate. You guys are like, I'm proud of the fact that I have friends with opposing views on my Facebook page. Like, I delete people because I'm like, this is my feed. This is my headspace. I'm holding this in my hand, and I would like to feel better at the end of the day when I'm done with this feed. And so I have it within my control to make sure that I feel better at the end of this feed. And every time I see something that this person says, it just blows up my day, and I can control that. Delete, gone, happier Elka, That's awesome. I can block people on my phone. You know how great that is? Oh my God. I just unblocked my ex and he's texting me up the fucking wazoo now. And I'm like, ah. Sorry, but Blocking people is good. Yes.
I'm the opposite. I will stay all day and engage to try to figure out how you get to be different. But then that's what I do for a living. So
Yeah,
Jake,
I
go ahead.
don't know. I think Elka's just given the smartphone version of this, but and that works. I'm not sure how useful these labels are. I'm thinking about some of your distinctions, Elka, you just made. You've got, especially in terms of the Black church and stuff, you've got incredible social mission of advocating for and being concerned about the poor, and yet they're different on LGBT, they're different on abortion, and so a lot of it is, it's I think a little bit more complicated than that. And Alice, to your point, it's an interesting critique that's in fact, especially among younger progressives who are saying, no, it's not up to us to understand the other side. It's not up to us to reach across the aisle when for 8 or 12 years, there's been no reaching across the aisle, right? And so I think that that's also a reality, that part of that kumbaya kind of thing that Elke was just describing on the left is the sense of, we try to understand, we try to put ourselves in your shoes and stuff like that. I know enough and read enough to understand how disaffected white men are of a certain kind from what's going on, because the world has changed. And on the one hand, I see, okay, let me try to understand that from your perspective. And I know how scary that gets. And I know how confusing that can be. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with your solutions. And there's got to be an understanding that it means one and not the other, right? At a certain point, understanding doesn't necessarily lead to agreement, and that's got to be okay.
I wanna toss one more thought out there. We got a few more minutes. Touching on Elke, what you said about happiness, and I think this is a really important point. We live in an era where we are all pundits in our own spheres, and I spend 80% of my time thinking about my own problems. I spend 19% of my time thinking about my friends' problems, and 1% of my time thinking about the world's problems. And so how can I be expected to actually be a competent political pundit? And I think that's something important to think about. And we have a few more minutes. I'll let you guys go on that. Anybody? Dan?
Yeah. Just to go with what Jay was saying, sometimes, for me, I like crossing over to the other side and saying, hey, why do you do what you do? Great examples. I had a lot of friends in the LGBTQ community. And I remember all the stuff, hanging out with them in bars, restaurants, going out. They knew I was straight. They knew that I didn't swing that way. But they got a kick out of, I was the straight guy. I was the vanilla breeder, as they said. I was the cis vanilla breeder hanging out with them because I didn't do all the stuff that they did. And I was like, so I don't care. I really just don't care. I think you're cool people. I want to hang out with you. And they're like, bet. I said, first round on me, and we'd just go. And why? Because the club had great music that night. or somebody that was there I wanted to go see. Why? And they were like, but you're conservative. Yeah, and I could cross the side and go, wow, and vice versa. I tell them, why don't you come on over here? Hey, I cook. I like cooking, guys. You want to come have? And they're more hesitant coming towards me, but I had no problem going towards them. I'm like, wow, I got to learn certain things that, I didn't think I'd experienced before just by walking across the other side. And it's kind of funny because people are like, well, how can you be conservative and still believe in that? Because they're human beings. They're my fellow citizens. I don't have to agree with them. You know, hey, I don't like grilled cheese with tomato in it. You want grilled cheese and tomato on it? Okay, I think you're a little weird, but go for it. You know, it's you know, uh, you know, there's been a weird, in my perspective, seeing unwillingness to cross over. I'm like, hey, you know, I like that crossing over. I'm like, okay, you want to have your thing? That's awesome. You know, let me experience it with you. You know, but a lot of times now people are like, well, this is my space and I don't want anybody from your space coming over here. Dating world is a great example of that, where people tell me, well, if you're a Trump supporter or conservative, I don't want to date you. Or if you voted for XYZ person, I'm not going to date you. I'm like, okay, fine. What was going to happen in my small view is what's happening already in the men's movement around the world, where you're going to have guys saying, you know what, you want the seat at the table, you want to control, have my seat, I'm gone.
Okay.
And which leads into Matt knows where I get into that section a lot.
I don't want to dive down there. Anybody else?
Yeah.
I could comment on respond to Matt. You said I guess what is you know, what right do each of us have in being our own pundit? I don't know, I guess I would argue exactly the inverse. Like, what if we didn't all act like pundits? Like, you know,
Yeah.
At what point is information harmful? You know, we need to be disseminating power all the time, right? Because power coagulates and collects, and so there has to be some opposing force where we are democratically splitting up the power, and people who have power aren't gonna like that, right? I don't know. I see it as like the youth and the aged. Like, this is never gonna change. That's all.
I guess I'm looking at the chat and the last question about how we collectively define truth. And I find myself, that's been a personal and philosophical struggle for me, from, you know, my Catholic period, my Freudian period, my neurobiological period, and now my old age. It's like, where did I come from and where am I going? And part of my doing these projects, talking to people from different perspectives, it's about a search for truth. And I just wonder where other people, should we be looking for that, or should it just be my truth? All truthiness, you know, my truth makes me feel happy, so it must be true.
You mean like my, I don't know, truth and happiness is no. No. Like, what I'm pursuing is my happiness.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like, there's only so much shit that I can handle.
Yeah.
Which is the truth. It's, you know yourself, you know what you need.
Yeah, I had the nigger, you know.
Yeah.
I had the bad part, you know,
Yeah.
and now I'm doing things differently.
If this were therapy, it would be go for it. Self-care.
Self-care. See you later. And I get it. I think I mentioned, you know, like, it's not the answer. I have family that I'm ignoring, and it does not make me happy. So is it the right thing to do? No. Am I doing it to preserve my sanity? Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good place to end on. That we have to be mindful of what we expect of ourselves in terms of how each one of us wants to influence the world. Because if we have unrealistic expectations for ourselves of how we want to influence the world, then maybe maybe we're trying too hard, and that's part of the problem.
Maybe.
All right. Thank you all so much for
Thank
doing
you.
this. This has been great. And the Facebook group will continue to be open if anyone wants to.
Yeah, you continue talking on the Facebook group. Please join.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Like,